Hello, everyone. I'm Patrice Relerford here, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Kenneth Eban from the Advancing Equity Coalition today. We are doing an update on the Advancing Equity Coalition's 2023 policy agenda. It's April, and as you know, the session has been in gear for several months now with lots of activity as it relates to education. Again, before we jump into that, I want to introduce my co-host on for this session and have him tell you a little bit about the Advancing Equity Coalition.
Yeah, so my name is Kenneth Eban, and I'm the executive director of the Advancing Equity Coalition. And so our mission as an organization is to develop the political will to eliminate institutional racism in Minneapolis public schools. And so there's a lot of key components here in our mission that I just want to draw attention to. The first one is that we actually are built as a coalition to focus on policy in Minneapolis public schools. And right now we're doing some work at the statewide level to support Minneapolis public schools in the ways that we think are important. But we are actually more focused on Minneapolis public schools. Another key component of our mission is really focusing on eliminating institutional racism. So addressing the policies and the practices that allow institutional racism to really show up and create some of the disproportionate outcomes that we see in our education system right now. And so that is a real focus for us as an organization and as a coalition. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll highlight a little bit about how we see institutional racism show up in Minneapolis public schools. So we see Minneapolis public schools experiencing institutional racism and perpetuating institutional racism in 5 major ways. The first is around resource and opportunity hoarding in white wealthy communities. Our second is around irrelevant curriculum and instruction. The third is around race neutral policies and practices. Fourth is around a lack of accountability structures. And then fifth is devaluing BIPOC communities and their cultures. So we see and we focus on addressing policies that result in or are creating these 5 different areas. And we work really hard to try to uproot them, bring awareness to them, and try to ultimately change them at the Minneapolis public schools level generally.
But for a coalition that's focused on Minneapolis public schools, would you just tell the viewers a little bit about why the members were interested this year? Because you guys have been around now since about 2020 or so, 2019 or 2020. Why they thought, okay, let's branch into state policy. We're focused on Minneapolis, grounded here, but why state policy and why now?
Yeah, so I think, and actually, if we can go to our next slide, I can highlight our coalition members and answer that question. We have a real diverse group of coalition members who are dealing with different issues with different communities that they serve. And so we have Central Tyrone Guzman, Coalition of Asian American Leaders, Legal Rights Center, Integrated Schools Minneapolis, Magazine, Northside Achievement Zone, Voices for Racial Justice, Educators for Excellence, and then ASER, the Hispanic Advocacy and Community Empowerment Through Research Group. And so these groups are doing a lot of different work and serve communities at a lot of different intersections. And so they all have their own individual agendas at the state legislature and locally and in community. And so we saw this as an opportunity this year with the amount of surplus that our state has available, with a $17 billion surplus and with a unified legislature, to say we need to figure out how we can leverage those resources and this opportunity for Minneapolis public schools, which is also really struggling financially. We know Minneapolis public schools is facing a fiscal cliff and is facing some real extreme decisions coming up. And so wanting to see how we can utilize the state as an opportunity to help support Minneapolis public schools and the students. And then on top of not only the financial issues, some of the statewide policies that are in place that can really push Minneapolis public schools to change and to support our students and students of color and Indigenous students in a much stronger and holistic way. Minneapolis public schools has been having a real serious decline in enrollment over the last several years. And Minneapolis was facing to make major changes in the middle of the pandemic, because some of the pandemic exacerbated some of those issues, some of the enrollment issues, some of the financial issues. But the financial aid that the federal government sent really did allow for the district to, essentially have a few years to figure out what they're going to do. So they use the federal aid that is running out in 2024 to balance their budget. And Now they'll have to figure out what happens after 2024. We called our policy agenda the Plan for Student Success in MPS. And so it was really broken down into 3 different categories. 1 was investing in a diverse teaching force. 2 was disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And then 3 was paying the debts owed to our students. And so we thought if we could focus on these 3 things as a coalition, that we could make sure students got the resources they desperately needed, make sure that students were well represented and their identities were reflected in their classroom and by the staff of schools, and then also that our students were welcome and included in their buildings, which are 3 huge components into making sure that all of our students are seen, all of our students are experiencing an improved academic setting, and we hopefully also can get improved outcomes as a result. So excited to dive in and just give a quick review over, what were some of the policies that we were following under these 3 areas. First, in investing in a diverse teaching force. So the first policy that we were really excited about following here was the Increasing Teacher of Color Act. And so this was a big bill that was being put forward to say, how can we invest in teacher pathways, remove barriers for teachers, and then also making sure that we create school environments that are welcoming, that are reflective of these teachers that we want to recruit into the building, and also curriculum that is reflective of these teachers that we want to recruit into the building. And so the ask was to make a $100 million investment, as well as making significant policy changes to improve the climate and the culture of the buildings. We're really excited about, some of the investments that are hopefully going to be made. But yeah, so that was the first one. The second one was around expanding and supporting Tier 1 and Tier 2 licensure in Minnesota. So Minnesota has a tiered licensure system. And, what we know is that there are 4 tiers in this system. And then each of the tiers gives you a different amount of years around how often you have to renew your license, and that also limits how many times you can renew that type of license. And then as connected to those different tiers, there are different education requirements. And then there is also a different level of stability that you're provided with those tiers. And so Tier 1 and Tier 2 are quote unquote lowest. I would actually say I'd say these are some of our most important tiers in our licensure areas. Because these are our tiers that are kind of our entry points into the profession.
And oftentimes, right, with these tiers, it's folks who have community expertise. Exactly. Maybe they have had a career in another area. So say someone who had been a mechanic or ran a shop, who may decide I want to go into Voltech and work within a district.
Yes, exactly. But it can also be, somebody who worked in a museum, or it could be somebody who, worked in library sciences, who was an engineer at 3M, whatever it may be. They just have different expertise. They went to school for different things, or they have a different background, and they came into the profession. And this is a really important area to really focus on how can we expand and support these teachers. This session actually ended up, instead of expanding and supporting this licensure area, it really ended up being around trying to defend and protect these opportunities to enter the classroom. And so excited to talk a little bit about where we're at with that right now. But what we do know is that Tier 1 and Tier 2 licensure and utilizing this tiered licensure strategy has helped diversify our teaching force in Minnesota. So disrupting the school to prison pipeline. So making sure that students aren't being pushed out of the classroom and then pushed into jail cells. And so the first one was around banning suspensions for kindergarten through grade 3. We should not be suspending. We should not be pushing our students out of the classroom, especially at that young of an age. So really excited about the movement around this bill. Also, we were really wanting to make sure that students weren't having recess, especially our youngest students weren't having recess taken away as a result of a punishment, because we know students need to, have fun, utilize energy, socialize, so that they're not bottled up all day in the classroom, giving students that real opportunity to make sure that they don't get in trouble, to have the ability to focus throughout the day and not withholding resources or recess as a punishment. And then the last one that we were focused on here in this area was really around making sure students and that student-adult relationship in a school was protected and held as sacred, because we know that relationships really matter. So ensuring that when a student has some type of issue and they make a statement to that trusted adult in a building, that statement cannot be used as evidence against them in any court proceedings. And so, this was an issue that our partners at the Legal Rights Center really focused on, and we're still learning about, and we're still passionate about. And unfortunately, that didn't get as much traction this year, but we're hoping for more conversation and more opportunities to learn in future legislative sessions. Then finally, around paying the debt owed to our students, we know that, again, we had a $17 billion surplus this year. While we built that $17 billion surplus, our schools were underfunded, our programs were underfunded, our mandated services were underfunded. And so that is why this is a debt owed to our students. And so we had 3 areas that we really wanted to focus on: fully funding special education and tying that funding to improve outcomes, fully funding English language learner services, and then connecting the education formula to inflation. And so these were our 3 areas that we really focused on. They're mostly financial. That's where we landed for our legislative agenda this year.
So before we move on to what's happened since we unveiled the agenda in February at our briefing, really quickly, just for education for the folks watching this, these areas are financial, as you mentioned, and there's also something called a cross subsidy that's related to special education and English language learner services. There's a pretty big impact on multiple districts across the state, especially MPS, also St. Paul Public Schools, many suburban districts. So to just really quickly talk a little bit about the cross subsidy and what that is, and then let's go into what's happened since February.
So the cross subsidy is basically schools are mandated by the federal government to provide, and the state, to provide services to students with that require special education services and that require English language learner services. Unfortunately, those services are largely unfunded mandates. And so what ends up happening is a student is required those services, but then some of those services are really expensive to operate, but there's no money provided for those services. And so school districts have to take money that were generated in other ways and then put that money towards providing those services for students because they're mandated. Now, the higher percentage of students you have in those populations that you have to provide services to, but do not generate that revenue in order to provide those resources, school districts then are having to put more and more money into that. And so they're subsidizing those services by pulling out of the general fund. Now, one thing I do want to make sure I say is all of these students are general education students first, right? And so it's not like they're stealing money from somewhere else and providing it to somewhere else. They're all general education students. The issue is that they also need additional services, and they deserve and they're entitled to those services because they deserve access to a well-rounded education, a high-quality education. However, there's no additional resources to put towards that. And so school districts who have higher populations of students that receive special education services or students that receive English language learner services are then struggling to figure out how do they actually pay for those services without breaking their budget. So, for example, Minneapolis Public Schools has invested an additional $80 million that they've had to pull from places in order to serve students in those 2 categories, specifically English language learners and special education, without it receiving any additional dollars to do so. And so, that is the big issue for Minneapolis Public Schools, and why this cross subsidy conversation is so important.
Thanks for that sort of overview of the cross subsidy and the impact on Minneapolis Public Schools. So a lot's happened since February. Would you start by just telling folks a little bit about what's happened, maybe starting with the teacher diversity and teacher workforce priority?
Yeah, so February, March, they were really busy months for committees. So we have both education finance committees and education policy committees in both the House and the Senate. They were hearing lots of bills constantly. I think they might have met 3 times a week at least over February and March. And one of the key issues outside of some of the funding priorities was around teacher diversity and also around this tiered licensure system. And so in early March, the Senate had a very lively committee hearing where several Minneapolis parents, school board members, different folks like that came out and said, hey, we do not want you to push forward some of the changes that you're proposing to the tiered licensure system, specifically around tier 2 licensure. And so what was happening is basically there are a bunch of different ways you can get a tier 2 license in Minnesota to be a teacher. And the Senate and the House actually both wanted to limit how you could get a tier 2 license by basically saying you need to go to a teacher prep or be enrolled in a teacher prep program, or you need to have a master's, or these very stringent and traditional ways of getting a license. So what has happened is that people have been able to get a teacher license by passing the teacher exam, or by being able to, they just had you can use your experience in different areas. You've been able to do it in a bunch of different ways. And really, what we're working on is trying to figure out how can we make sure that teachers still have that breadth of opportunities and that diversity of ways you can enter the classroom, because providing a diverse set of opportunities to enter the classroom improves teacher diversity, right? And I think that's the important thing. Other issue that they're trying to change is they're trying to change the way you can move from a tier 2 license to a tier 3 license. And the reason why someone would want to move from a tier 2 license to a tier 3 license is there are 2 main reasons. One is because if you have a tier 2 license in Minnesota, that license is only good for 2 years. So you have to renew your license every 2 years. The other issue is that if you're on a tier 2 license in Minnesota, you can only renew it 3 times. And so you can only be a tier 2 teacher or a teacher on a tier 2 license for 8 years total. But on tier 3, that license is good for 3 years and you can do unlimited renewals. So that creates a little bit more stability in your life. That you can be a teacher for more than 10 years, all these different things. And then there's a bunch of other technical issues that is in place too, so that I won't get into. But, so we've been working really closely with our coalition, along with other advocates in the space like Ed Allies, Bridge Makers, even the Association of Metropolitan School Districts is against this. The Minnesota School Board Association is against this. The Minnesota Association of School Administrators is against this. And so, so we've been working with a really broad coalition to really make sure that, these changes to tier 2 licensure don't take place. And so, that committee hearing took place in the Senate. And fortunately, due to the, really strong advocacy, really by a lot of Minneapolis folks, they came out and said, do not make these changes. And the Senate bill did change to say, instead of, limiting all of the opportunities to get a tier 2 license, they said, okay, we won't make any of those changes. The only change that is in place in the Senate still is that change from getting a tier 2 to a tier 3 license. They're trying to limit that pathway still, but you can still enter the profession on a tier 2 license in a bunch of different ways. But making that change from tier 2 to tier 3 is still being limited, which is what the governor also wants right now, which is the challenge.
One of the sort of points that I noticed from the testimony in the Senate is just that this is the tier 2 to tier 3 pathway. Oftentimes that's how teachers with more diverse backgrounds enter the field. Could you tell people just quickly about the state of teacher diversity in Minnesota, just to give them this is why this is important?
Yeah. So first of all, what we know for sure about teacher diversity is all students benefit by having a diverse set of teachers, right? Every single student benefits from that. Minnesota has 6% of their teachers are non-white. 94% of our teachers in Minnesota are white. That is a stark difference to the percentage of students that are not white in Minnesota. We have a lot of important work to do in order to diversify our teaching force in Minnesota. And so, that tier 2 to tier 3 pathway is really important, because what it does is it says, if you've been teaching on a tier 2 license for 3 years and you have a successful summative evaluation, you can get a tier 3 license. If that pathway is taken away, you can try to get a tier 3 license through portfolio, which lots of people have struggled with. Or you can, complete a teacher prep program, which again, lots of people have struggled with because of cost and, a bunch of different issues. My big thing about that is, why would we say, hey, we can give somebody a tier 3 license if you graduate from a teacher prep program without ever demonstrating that you're successful in the classroom? While if you're teaching on a tier 2 license, you've demonstrated that you're successful in the classroom, and for over a number of years, now you can have a tier 3 license. Why would we take that opportunity away? So I think this is a real equity issue in terms of keeping teachers of color out of the classroom. We know that, what the opponents of this are saying is that only 17 teachers have ever taken advantage of the summative evaluation pathway to a tier 3 license. Only 99 people have tried it, and only 17 of those were teachers of color. The issue is, again, two things. One, this has only been around long enough for only one cohort of teachers to move through that pathway.
Yeah, licensure, wasn't it changed the tiered system was implemented less than 5 years ago?
Yeah, it was 2019 when this was implemented. So
it really hasn't been enough time to make those sort of generalizations.
Exactly. So, this was the first cohort that had a chance and the opportunity to do so. The second is 17 of those, they're saying only 17 teachers of color have taken advantage of that. That percentage is still 3 times as high as the percentage of teachers of color in the state of Minnesota. So this is actually working 3 times better than what your past strategies have been working. So that is the issue at hand with the tiered licensure and the teacher of color work. The other stuff around they've had really successful hearings. They had one really nasty hearing in the Senate that got pretty racist and problematic, but has largely been supported and is moving through the legislature as well. So, and the legislative process as well.
And I know with the discipline disparities work, there wasn't a lot of traction there, right? Around the school to prison pipeline.
So there wasn't a ton of traction this year on that last issue around making sure, protecting that relationship between students and school staff, and making sure that any statements made to school staff on a disciplinary issue doesn't turn into a evidence in a legal proceeding. But the K-3 suspension ban is moving forward, and the ban on withholding recess as a punishment is moving forward. So we are excited about both of those things. And yeah, we're excited about what that means for our students, and hopefully we stop pushing our youngest learners out of the classroom and fostering this idea that the classroom isn't for them, or that their energy is too much, or whatever it might be. So
what was compelling, you think, for legislators in terms of having those priorities make it into the omnibus bill?
Well, I think, first of all, it was a lot of this has been work that's been taking place for years. So this wasn't the first year that legislators have heard this conversation. So I think that was the number one thing. I think 2 was hearing just the fact that we are suspending, kindergartners, first graders, second graders, third graders, what that means for them. I think that has been an issue. And so I think that was exciting for them. And then, yeah, same with the recess stuff, understanding the idea that a student, taking away students' recess isn't going to help a student ultimately focus better or behave better moving into the future. And so I think those were the main issues and main talking points that I think legislators were hearing. And I think, the Democrats were listening to that, have been listening to that for years. And this year they finally had the opportunity in both chambers to push it forward. So I think that's exciting.
And then that last bucket, again, with those financial priorities, lots of like big price tags with some of those priorities. What happened there? What either differences or where was there accord between, or is there accord between legislators and the governor with some of those financial priorities related to special ed, English language learners, and then tying the general funding formula to inflation?
Yeah, so this one was a hard one. So, again, the state's looking at a $17 billion surplus. We know a lot of that money, a good chunk of that money was only one-time use money. So we know that it couldn't be used, a lot of it moving forward into the future. I think the challenge that we have is that at some point in March, the governor, the Speaker of the House, and the Majority Leader in the Senate made an agreement to say, here's how much we can spend in each area. Here's how much we can spend in education. Here's how much we can spend in housing. Here's how much we can spend in higher education. Here's how much we can spend in the judiciary, wherever else they wanted to put money. The amount of money the additional money that got invested in the education was $2.2 billion, which is a ton of money. That's a lot of money in general. But for education was not nearly enough money, especially for the things that the education committees were hoping to address. And so what ends up happening is that $2.2 billion, one of the biggest price tags of things that cost money for the state right now is the cross subsidy in special education. That cross subsidy alone was going to be $1.5 billion for 2024, 2025, which is the years that they're budgeting for right now. And so, the governor, so if they were going to pay that off totally or cover that totally, then there wouldn't be enough money for several other things. Because we're starting at that number of 2.2 billion. I think the state and the governor should have put in more money towards education, at least 3 billion. And the priorities of the governor and and leadership essentially needed to change. I think they did not put enough money in education, but we know that that's been something that Governor Walz had wanted to do last year, and he said he wanted to do this year. But I think he put in $3 billion towards tax credits and refunds and those types of things. He put in $2.3 billion into infrastructure. And so education ended up coming in third. And I think education needed to come in first in a serious way, especially with some of the promises that were made, during the campaigns, after the election season was over. And just, again, the way that our state has built up this surplus while our schools are struggling and are underfunded and our students aren't having their services well resourced or properly resourced. And so that's a debt still owed to our students, and it's a debt that is in place again.
So in terms of just numbers that are out there right now, I know overall you said 2 billion something for education. What, in terms of the cross subsidy for special ed and English language learners, is on the table? And then also, like, just to provide a little bit more specific, what exactly is on the table, knowing that it didn't close that gap?
Yeah. So for special education specifically, so this is then where it becomes tricky. So the House and the Senate created two different plans around how they want to spend the money. The House put in more money towards the House put in money towards the formula, so adding more money to the basic formula for education, and they said they want to connect the funding formula to inflation, but capping it at 3% at a 3% increase. So basically, what that means is that as the rate of inflation increases, the House's bill would say we need to increase the education funding formula by that much, but only up to 3%. And that is in line with what the governor wanted. So that's the governor's bill essentially. And that's exactly what the governor wanted. The House also put money towards eventually closing the English language learners cross subsidy, which is smaller than the special education one. And then the House also said they were going to close the special education cross subsidy by about 47%. It's less than 50%. So that's what's in the House's bill.
So House, just as a recap, fully closing the ELL cross subsidy within the biennium.
Not within the biennium, within 2 bienniums.
Within 2, 4, so like not 2020, 2027 or 2028, basically?
Yeah, it's 2 out, yeah.
And then for special ed, doing about 50, special education about 50% there, 40 set under 50%.
Yeah.
And then so what happened with the Senate?
So the Senate said we're going to put 4% onto the education funding formula, but we're not pushing it out and then connecting it to inflation. So they have not put any money towards inflation. They also decided they were going to eventually fund the special education cross subsidy up to 60%, or closing it up to 60%. So, a little better than the House. And then they put some money towards also closing the special education or the English language learner cross subsidy. And so, those were significant investments. The other thing that I just wanted to mention as well, because I think people do forget that, this is a big funding priority, is around the Increasing Teacher of Color Act. And so the Senate put in enough money to fund about 75% of that 100 million, so about $75 million, where the House only put in about $40-ish million into that as well. So, the House really, so what ends up really happening is, and I think how, depending on who you talk to, this is how you could characterize the breakdown. The House invested money in connecting the funding formula to inflation. The Senate invested money in putting that money into the special education cross subsidy. And again, I'm frustrated as an advocate, as somebody who's paying attention to all this, saying, hey, Minneapolis Public Schools really needs resources in really important ways. The state leadership should have put more money into education to begin with, because they didn't. Now it's like, now we're all in scarcity mindset again, and we're all fighting with each other about where the money should go. Because, the education funding formula, and, just looking at that does really benefit school districts that have smaller populations of special education students and students whose English is their second language, right? And so that's really our first, second ring suburban districts. And then our, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then our rural districts also, our outstate Minnesota and greater Minnesota districts really need that special education cross subsidy money and that English language learner cross subsidy money, because they're the ones that are being hit the hardest by some of those costs really being driven up. And so, now, I actually went and supported, and I testified in committee in support of connecting the education funding formula to inflation. Now, looking at where the target is and where money is, like that is not the best thing for Minneapolis Public Schools between the two options that we have in front of us right now. So that's where we're at, and it's really frustrating to see that play out.
Yeah, it's very frustrating to see it be positioned in this either or way, because we know that the special education costs are hurting districts around the state. We also know that inflation is a reality, and that it's not either or here. Both are issues that are really plaguing districts around the state, particularly like the Minneapolis, St. Paul. Also, I've heard too, some of the greater Minnesota districts like Rochester also deal with the cross subsidy in a significant way, St. Cloud. So yeah, And then, so sort of where are we, what's next? So I know they're on break right now for spring break, coming back in April, like what is it, next week? So what's ahead? I believe the committee hearings are over. So like what's next at the
Yeah.
legislature?
So basically, yeah, committee hearings are over. And so now they've all created their big omnibus bill. And so an omnibus bill is basically all the bills that the chair heard that they liked, they're gonna like bring into their bill. So they've already, or they create, so they create like a big bill. Like it's a huge bill. I don't know what else to say. But they have heard their bills, and so right now they're tinkering with their bills. So they're saying, okay, here's where we're at, whatever. So the big steps that are going to take place now over the next 6 weeks or so for the rest of session are they're going to have to go to conference committee. And so conference committee is, the House has their version of their education bill. The Senate has their version of their education bill. They're going to have to negotiate around what is going to actually be included in the final bill that the governor should sign. And so they're going to have those, so they call those conference committees. So they'll have those conference committees figure out, and they'll negotiate, figure out what's going to be in their final bills. Those bills will then be sent to the floor of both the House and the Senate. And then the governor will sign those bills at the end of session. And so they have to do that for all the major committees, and all the bills that haven't already been signed into law. Like you might have seen things like universal school meals, that's already hit the floor and it's been signed by the governor, or restore the vote, or driver licenses for all. Those things have already hit the floor and have been signed by the governor. But now these big omnibus bills still have to be signed and negotiated between the two different the two chambers and the two relevant committees around those chambers. So that is what's left here for the rest of the legislative session.
Is there any place where the folks watching, our advocates out in the community can be helpful still in terms of like contacting legislators, or is there any other actions folks can take at this point?
Yeah, so there are a couple of quick actions that would be really important. So one is around this tiered licensure issue. And again, our partners at Ed Allies, along with all of our coalition members, are really, really focused and really, really concerned about where the legislature is right now on this tiered licensure issue. And so what would make a huge difference is if you reach out to the chairs of the education committees, as well as your own legislators, and tell them that you do not want to see any changes to tier 2 licensure, or any changes to tier licensure period this session. That would be really important. What we really want to make sure that they know that people are paying attention and they are opposed to this, because they're banking on the fact that no one knows enough about tiered licensure. No one cares enough about tiered licensure except for the few advocates that keep coming to us. And so,
can you quickly say the names of both chairs?
So the chairs in the Senate are Steve Sweditsky and then Mary Kunish. And then the chairs in the House are Lori Pryor and then Cheryl Joachim. So those are the chairs to be reaching out to and talking to you about that. And then your own legislators, especially if you live in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis delegation should be opposed to this. This is going to hurt Minneapolis public schools more than any other district, because we have the most teachers on a tier 2 license in Minneapolis. Over half of our teachers on a tier 2 license are teachers of color, and over a quarter of them teach special education. And so this is going to hurt Minneapolis in really problematic ways. And so our Minneapolis delegation needs to be opposed to this. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I hate to say this because I really do believe in some of the things that are in the House omnibus bill, but you have to support the Senate omnibus bill. It's going to result in more dollars for Minneapolis public schools, and it's going to put a bigger investment into increasing teachers of color. And so telling your legislator, telling the education committees that you support the Senate omnibus bill, and also the Senate has a better version of the tier 2 issue than the House does right now. So if nothing changes, at least the Senate version is better than the House version, but support the Senate version of the omnibus bill, and tell them, we shouldn't have had to choose to begin with, but the Senate version is in better shape right now, in terms of actual dollars that Minneapolis Public Schools will receive.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. I've really enjoyed doing this update with you. Again, just want to remind the viewers, I'm Patrice Relerford. I am the Senior Director of Impact and Collective Giving at the Minneapolis Foundation. I've had the pleasure of following the work of the Advancing Equity Coalition for a few years here, since their launch in 2019. We will send out just a follow-up with this to our supporters and also post this on our website and in our links to it in our social media channels, but also want to encourage folks to check out the Advancing Equity Coalition website. Kenneth, do you want to tell them just how to learn more about your organization really quickly before we wrap?
Yeah, so feel free to go to www.advancingequitycoalition.org. There you can find a couple of different ways to get involved. You can see some of our recent school board recaps. You can also click on Power Up the Plan for Student Success in MPS and receive weekly action alerts around how you can get involved and support our legislative agenda. Also, we really do rely on the donations of like-minded and supportive individuals to help make this work and make this run and be as successful as we can be. So please, if you are in the position to give, we'd love for you to do so. And you can find out how to on all of that is on our website. You can also follow us on social media. So thank you so much for the opportunity to give this recap and give you an update around what's going on at the legislature.
No problem, Kenneth. Again, great to work with you. And for everyone watching, again, we'll post this on the Minneapolis Foundation's website, social media channels. And just want to thank everyone for following education issues this year at the legislature, following our work, and look forward to seeing you all again. And thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kenneth.
Thank you.